I'll also begin recording the session. Okay, I think
no
we
schedule,
are
I
ready
am
to
free totally.
begin.
I have no schedule, I am totally free.
Nice, sir.
It's okay, so we'll try and stick to the schedule regardless. So I think we're ready to begin. So good evening and a very warm welcome to all those here today. We are privileged that everyone watching was able to take the time to join us on this very special occasion. We at Primus Books are delighted to welcome you to the virtual launch of our new title, Religion, Community and Nation, Hindu Consciousness and Nationalism in Colonial Punjab by Professor K.L. Tuteja. The volume we are here to celebrate gives us a glimpse into the growth of the Hindu communitarian identity in the late 19th and early 20th centuries in India, offering a nuanced perspective on the differences between communitarianism and communalism. Professor Tuteja's work also explores the nascent form of nationalism that was emerging across the country. It focuses on the interface between nationalist and communitarian identities, which led to the growth of a unique trend in colonial Punjab, also followed by Lala Lajpat Rai, which is the nationalist communitarian perspective. Now, before we move on to the main event, please allow me to introduce this evening's discussants, beginning with our esteemed author. Professor K.L. Tuteja is former professor of modern Indian history at Kurukshetra University. He was a visiting professor at the University of the West Indies at St. Augustine, Trinidad and Tobago, the El Colegio de Mexico, Mexico City, and the Central University of Hyderabad. He has been a senior fellow at Nehru Memorial Museum and Library, New Delhi, and a Tagore Fellow at the Indian Institute of Advanced Studies, Shimla. His previous publications include Historical Diversities, Society, Politics and Culture, and Tagore and Nationalism. Our chief guest tonight, Professor Irfan Habib, is Professor Emeritus at Aligarh Muslim University. One of the most prominent historians of India today, Professor Habib has authored several works on ancient and medieval India as well as on Marxist historiography, including the Agrarian System of Mughal India, 1556 to 1707, and the People's History of India series, which has changed the way history is taught in campuses across the country. For his contribution to education, Professor Habib was awarded the Padma Bhushan in 2005. Primus Books is proud to have published his co-authored volume, Braj Bhoom and Mughal Times, The State, Peasants and Gosens. We also have three eminent panelists for a discussion on the book with us this evening. Professor Dipankar Gupta's career spans academics, government agencies, and the corporate world. Now retired from Jawaharlal Nehru University, Professor Gupta has also formerly been associated with other prestigious institutions such as Delhi School of Economics, the Reserve Bank of India, the National Security Advisory Board, and the News Broadcasting Standards Authority. Apart from writing regularly on socio-political issues in newspapers, Professor Gupta has also penned many important works on topics like ethnicity, modernity, caste, and stratification, some of which include culture, space, and the nation state, from sentiment to structure, and caste in question, identity or hierarchy. Our second speaker, Professor Anshu Malhotra, is professor in the Department of Global Studies and Kundan Kaur Kapani Professor and Chair of Sikh and Punjab Studies at the University of California at Santa Barbara. Her research on gender studies, cultural studies, autobiography studies, and histories of South Asia, in particular that of Punjab and the Sikhs, has led to the publication of multiple volumes on these subjects, including Piro and the Gulab Dasis, Gender, Sect and Society in Punjab, and Gender, Caste and Religious Identities, Restructuring Caste in Colonial Punjab. Our final speaker this evening is Dr. Vikas Pathak. Dr. Pathak has conducted research on modern Indian history for the last 2 decades, focusing on facets of Indian nationalism. As deputy political editor of The Hindu and during his multiple previous assignments with media outlets like the Hindustan Times and the Indian Express, Dr. Pathak has analyzed contemporary Indian politics and policy and has written about the key political organizations of the country. We at Primus are pleased to have previously published his volume, Contesting Nationalisms, Hinduism, Secularism and Untouchability in Colonial Punjab, 1880 to 1930. After our esteemed panelists have all said a few words, we will have a short Q&A session with the author. So if anybody has a question for Professor Tuteja, please feel free to leave it in the Q&A box below. Now, before we release the volume, I kindly request Mr. B.N. Verma to say a few words.
Good evening, everyone. It's a real privilege to have, share the floor with Irfan Sahab, Dipankar Sahab, Anshu, Vikas, some of whom are our author, and some of whom with whom I have interacted at a very personal level. It's a very overwhelming moment for me. I don't know how to express my feelings. Well, it's been a long journey for me, about 50 years in this profession. And there are various people who have influenced me. When I was a student, I had the privilege of interacting with my contemporaries like Arvind Das, Dilip Simyan, Rabindra Ray, just to name a few. And that sort of sucked me into the protest movements that was going on in my college in those days. And somehow that ignited a passion for history inside. And I used to wonder, how could I come near these people, these stalwarts? I used to hear big names in those days, very big names. Well, finally, I got the opportunity when Macmillan gave me a break, and I had the privilege of working with Mr. Samuel Israel, Tejeshwar Singh, Adrian Soot, Pamulo, and then later with Mr. Ravi Dayal, the great Mr. Ravi Dayal, Mr. Dipen Mitra, Buddhadev Bhattacharya. These were real stalwarts. And they sort of made me realize that if there was something happening in amongst the Indian academic world, it was in the discipline of history. And therefore, I took a liking to history, although my own area of study has been literature. I moved over to history and, forayed into editorial, providing editorial support to authors as much as I could. And that's when I came in contact with people serious scholars like Ram Sharan Babu. I can't forget him. He was the first one who sort of gave me a break. And that was a long time ago. Then there was Professor Sankalia, and there was Professor Sarkar. And at that point of time, I used to hear constantly about Irfan Sahab. He was a legend even in those days. I'm talking of 70s. And all these memories come flooding, and I don't know what to say, except that I want to express my sincere thanks to all of you, particularly Irfan Sahab, to whom I promised once, I have published your work, I'm going to seek retirement. And that's what I've done. I've decided to call it a day. But before I did that, the last book that I published was Tuteja Sahab's. And I'm glad I was associated with that project, although it's my final project as a regular at Primus Books. But it was a very rewarding experience, a very enriching experience. I learned something from you, Tuteja Sahab, to be honest. I really learned something. And I'm grateful to you that you gave me the opportunity to publish this. So my sincere thanks to you, to Irfan Sahab. It's a pity I couldn't publish Dipankar Sahab. I was very keen to do so, nor could I publish Anshu. But I had the privilege of, publishing Vikas. Vikas, thank you very much. And I hope and I'll carry all these memories with me, So thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you so much, sir. Now, without further ado, I request Professor Habib, Professor Gupta, Professor Malhotra, Dr. Pathak, and Professor Tuteja to release the volume and hold it up for the audience.
The map comes up.
Yes. so much. I now invite our chief guest, Professor Habib, to address the audience.
Professor Tuteja, my colleagues on the panel, Verma Sahab, and friends. Professor Tuteja's book is really to be celebrated because of its real boldness. It actually takes up a question and the problem, particularly relating to Punjab, which needed elucidation. As the map on his book shows, that Punjab was a creation of the British, but it left three communities in the Punjab. What is now Haryana had a Hindu majority, with Jat peasantry in particular. As we went on from the Haryana districts and some parts of the Jind and Patiala states, and went northwest, you came to the Punjabi-speaking Punjab. In it, there was a curious situation that Hindus who were in a majority in the country, but if you put Haryana aside, but in this part, a minor community, educated, mercantile, mainly, along with, of course, the scholarly Brahmins, but almost overwhelmed in that part by Muslims and Sikhs. This was a curious situation in which within the Punjabi speaking area, the Hindus were in limited numbers when you compare them with Muslims, of course, who were in such numbers that they constituted the majority in the whole province. And then, of course, a very substantial Sikh population, particularly on peasantry. Now, until 47, these units, different parts in the Punjab, had to conduct politics together. And naturally, the problems were considerable. There were the two major languages, spoken languages, Punjabi and Hindustani with its two literary languages, Hindi and Urdu. And for reasons which it's difficult to go into, but Urdu became the basic language at school and universities in the Punjab. I remember Jawaharlal Nehru saying once that the whole controversy between Punjabi and Hindi is being conducted in Urdu newspapers. That in one time an Urdu newspaper from Jalandhar after 47 was said to be the largest Urdu paper with its circulation in the world. So Urdu as the major working language, but with particular assertions about Hindi and of course Sikh interests in Punjabi and Gurmukhi. All these problems gave a very complex cultural situation in the Punjab. And then there was, of course, the issue of Indian nationalism, which should have brought everyone together. Of course, the Punjabi immigrants who were the major force behind the Ghadar movement, which produced so many heroes and which influenced Bhagat. In this world, lived and worked Lala Lajpat Rai. And I think the wonderful thing about Professor Tuteja's work is that it brings to light the problems that Lala Lajpat Rai had to face. An Arya Samaj's background, which was natural because Arya Samaj, though its founder was an outsider, had its base in the Punjab, and it seemed to be a reformist movement to everyone, despite its very hostility to other religions, which moved Gandhiji to criticize it very strongly. But essentially, it was also seen as a reform movement, which drew to it Lala Lajpat Rai. On the one hand, the demands of nationalism, on the demands of his constituency, which was in effect Arya Samaj's Hindu constituency. What Professor Tuteja does wonderfully for us is to present the problem in all its details and all its complexities. And I, for one, have always been in sympathy with Lala Lajpat Rai with his two major constituencies, the nationalist and the communal, which Professor Tuteja would ask us to leave out unless the conflict is involved. Welfare work for one's community, he styles communitarian. I'm totally with him here. Much of Lala Lajpat Rai's work would be styled as communitarian. But I really admire Professor Tuteja for the detailed work on the complexities of the situation, almost from date to date. With Lala Lajpat Rai as a major figure involved, because Professor Tuteja ends with Lala Lajpat Rai's martyrdom in 1928. And it is fitting to remember that he died while attacked by police in a demonstration against the Simon Commission. He sacrificed his life for the nation. No particular communal issue was involved in the opposition to Simon Commission. The opponents included almost everyone from Mahatma Gandhi to Mr. Jinnah. I would say that there was a similar problem for Muslim nationalists who had a Muslim constituency, apparently in conflict with the Hindu and Sikh community. And they had a nationalist constituency. Dr. Kichlu, for example, and later on Iftikharuddin had this particular thought. So Lala Lajpat Rai was not alone. I will end by referring to an interview I had with Iftikharuddin, for long the leading Congress figure in the Punjab, in 1946 when he had joined the Muslim League. His in-laws lived next to our house. And I, a 15-year schoolboy, went and protested at his joining the Muslim League. And he told me that, no, just a schoolboy. He went on explaining that actually his position was not changed. He was all for friendship with Hindus. He was all for the freedom of the country. He was still a great admirer of Mahatma Gandhi. And then I asked him, why did you join the Muslim League? He said, when you come to the Punjab, you will understand my dilemma. A man of a high position talking like with a schoolboy, I still admire that man. And when Gandhiji died, he had a very heartfelt message at his death, which I think was one of the most moving ones, that whoever ever lifted a hand against an innocent man, woman, and child is complicit in the murder of Mahatma Gandhi. So the problem of the Punjab with these three communities was a very complex one, and it is very difficult to find an answer to that complexity even today, when even the partition has totally divided the country. And I think one of the greatest massacres after World War II took place in the Punjab. We tend to forget it, but that is a sin on the whole people of India, that happened and not a single one was punished. So it's very important for India today to study what happened in the Punjab. And therefore, Professor Tuteja's very important work is offers a solid basis for that consideration. I would end by saying that by writing this book, he has paid a very important and worthy tribute to one of India's great national leaders, who, as I've just said, after all, fell a martyr in the struggle against British rule. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Habib. I now request our esteemed author, Professor Tuteja, to introduce his volume to everyone here today. Professor Tuteja, you're on mute. Could you please unmute yourself?
Sorry.
Yes, we can hear you now.
Thank you very much, Jyotika. At the outset, I'm indeed thankful to Primus and his team, especially Verma Saab, for publishing this book, and to Parsoon, to Jyotika and others for organizing this book launch program. Sir, after what Irfan Saab has said about the book, I don't have any word to say more about it. But as you have asked me to say something, actually, I would like to respond more to the questions raised by the distinguished panelists and other participants. But at the same time, I just want to explain one or two points why I took up this subject. I took up this subject, initially, I thought of working on communalism in Punjab. Communalism as a phenomenon opposed to nationalism. This is what we have been studying as a part of history. I mean, communalism and nationalism in binary relationship. And what I found interesting in Punjab, that in Punjab, there is a which Anshu Malhotra also worked out, that at one time there was a very strong shared tradition. Yet Punjab witnessed the worst kind of communal violence in 1957. What happened? How this situation transformed? That troubled me a lot. And once in autobiography, Jawaharlal Nehru writes that Punjab was the storm center of communalism in 1920s. So that led me to work on communalism, but somehow the problem was very complex in Punjab. And I thought that I should see how the communities themselves were formed. Because I don't, or already Harjot O'Brien has already said about it, that communities, that the British construction of Indian communities as given is not valid and needs to be questioned, which he did in the case of Sikhs. And I tried to study in the case of Hindus. So my focus was essentially shifted from communalism as a whole problem, as a problem vis-a-vis nationalism. I wanted to study now the emergence and growth of Hindu consciousness and its interaction with nationalism at different stages and phases. With this object I moved, and in that process, what I found that majority of the middle class people in all the three countries in the late 19th century were participating in nationalism as well as communitarian activities at the same time. They did not find any kind of antagonism between the two, and I found Rajput was the most prominent among them. And more important was that in Punjab, majority of those persons who were active initially were from the Hindu community. Of course, there were Muslims also, there were Sikhs also. So I wanted to study how it was possible for the Hindus to work at the same time in communitarian politics as well as in national politics. That led me to take up this subject. And I and the method, the second point which I want to say, my method was very simple. And that was I studied the rise of Hindu consciousness as a part of historical process since late 19th century Punjab. And that was that how in the pre-colonial Punjab, there was a very strong tradition of shared culture, not only shared culture, but also the communities were very, very, very blurred. And it was not only in the Sikhs and the Muslims, but also among the Hindus also. There was nothing like given community as Hindus. And what I found that how from the Arya Samaj, the rise of Arya Samaj, one idea of Hindu community was given. In 1909, it was redefined in 1909 by Rajput Rai, and in 1920s, again, a different meaning was given by some of the leaders like Ramanand. So there's nothing like one definition of Hindus as far as the Punjab was concerned. So it was undergoing many changes, and therefore I tried to study it in context with nationalism. And third thing which I want to say about it, for me, Hindu community was not monolithic, and Hindu identity too was not monolithic in a very simple word. And what I found that there were different trends within the Hindu community which was being formed. I use the word imagine. I borrowed this word from Benedict Anderson, and I found that this community consciousness was not was divided into. I mean, can be divided into different parts. What I found, one as the communitarian collaborators, the other as communitarian nationalists, and third, how how a very important section was developing, having a communal ideology where Muslim was seen as the other. Initially, it was taken up by Lal Chand, and later in 1920s by Parmanand. And Parmanand was at one time under the influence of Savarkar. Interestingly, when I end my book, I see Lajpat Rai's situation very complex. Lajpat Rai throughout maintained that India needs to be a unified nation. He was a strong supporter of Congress. He rejected the idea of Hindu nation. Yet, seeing the situation in Punjab, the position of the Hindus minority, and therefore I consider that if we want to study Lajpat Rai, we need to study him in the context of Punjab, though his focus was larger all India. So what happens that Rajpat Rai takes up the idea of Hindu majoritarian identity of India. But his concern was to fight for the cause of Hindu minority in Punjab. And the difference between him and Malviya was also there. For Malviya, majoritarian identity is he wanted to use it as a strength vis-a-vis Muslim in Indian politics, as a pressure tactic. Whereas for Lajpat Rai, he thought that if Hindu majoritarian identity at the all India level gets strengthened, possibly he would be able to defend the interest of the Hindus, interest means quote unquote, of the Hindus in Punjab. So this kind of dilemma was very strong in Lajpat Rai. So what happens? He remains committed to Indian nationalism, yet he strengthened the Hindu majoritarian identity at the all India. And that is, I think, a very complex aspect of Lajpat Rai's personality. And I find difficult to agree with those who outrightly condemn him as communal, and at the same time those who also eulogize him for his very dynamic approach. He was not at all communal and all that. So this kind of labels, either as totally communal or opposed to communalism, I found there was a need to restudy, and this was my attempt, which I did. Thank you very much, Jyotika.
Thank you so much, sir, for your words. I now invite our first panelist this evening, Professor Gupta, to say a few words.
Thank you very much. I hope you can all hear me.
Yes, yes.
Good, good. I'm grateful to be amongst my colleagues and friends, new friends. Speaking after Professor Irfan Habib is emblematic of the fact that most of us have followed him all our lives. So I'm happy to follow him again. Professor Tuteja, Kundan Tuteja, I got to know him in the Nehru Memorial Museum, and what a wonderful man he is. I am happy to meet Professor Anshu Malhotra and Professor Vikas Pathak. Professor and Mr. B.N. Varma, I listened to all the heroes you mentioned, and they're all historians and not a single sociologist. So I don't think you really wanted to publish me. And I don't blame you, because here I am, hidden amongst cats, all historians here, and I'm a lone sociologist, and I probably will let my side down. But nevertheless, I thank you, President Chatterjee, Jyotika Ivaya so much, Jyotika Mansata, and Sumit Ghosh for making me a part of this gathering. I'm somewhat disappointed, unhappy with Kundan Tuteja, because he wrote the book too late. I wish he had written earlier, because then I wouldn't have babbled on as I did in my earlier publications, because what he has written about communalism and communitarianism, if I had known about this, say, at least 10 years back or 15 years back, I think some of my publications would have had more meaning. But nevertheless, it's never too late to learn. I'm so happy that he has written what he has written, because he has certainly cleared up many cobwebs in my mind. And I think I know a lot more today about what's happening in India, contemporary India, in terms of communalism and communitarianism, though it's from the optic of what Lala Lajpat Rai had witnessed and lived through the eyes of Professor Tuteja. It is a book of history, but all good books of history are actually obsessions with the present. And I think what Kundan Tuteja has written is very resonant with what's going on in the country today, and not just today, but the past few years, or few decades, in fact. And they make a lot of sense to me as I read him. And what is even more devastating for me was my complete overhaul, the impression I had of Lala Lajpat Rai. And I'm so glad you've corrected me on this score as well. From my point of view, I found that your distinction between communitarianism and communalism, which is absolutely upfront in a book, very, very enlightening. And this is one aspect which I wish I had learned from you earlier, because it would have made my life much easier. But you didn't have the good fortune of doing so. Now I understand that communitarianism is something which is inner directed, and doesn't really have to have an enemy, unlike communalism, which is other directed. And as you have pointed out, a communitarian identity has many features in it. It's very rich with layer upon layer, one imbricated upon the other. Whereas in communalism, the features are few, it's very sparse. There's a poverty by itself of features. Communitarianism, on the other hand, is broad, is high, is multifaceted, and communalism is sharp, pointed, angular, and aimed at certain communities. In the communitarian perspective, you're constantly adding new features as time goes on. You're adding new features, it's more heritage oriented. New things are being said, new things are being done, new, shall we say, customs are being created, and all of these become part of the communitarian tradition, as it were. Whereas, and it's very slow to change. It keeps adding on, becomes heavier and heavier, very slow to change. In fact, I now recall Frederick Barth, the anthropologist, who talked about cultural walls and boundaries. And these were just like communitarian identities. It was very multifaceted, heavy, blank, you might say at certain points. But unlike communalism, it wasn't sharp, angular, or aimed at anybody else, but aimed at the community itself. So it was more introverted than extroverted. It's very slow to change, and it doesn't respond to immediate history with as much agility as communalism does. And I think Rajput Rai was sitting in a very, very hard place, as Professor Tuteja just mentioned. And his life enlivens this difference between communitarianism and communalism more than anything else I know. And Professor Tuteja has done a great job in bringing this up as vividly as he has. Also, I think it enlivened, in my mind at least, this business that we discuss a great deal in sociology and social anthropology particularly, between book view and field view. And the normal assumption is, and this comes from Professor Srinivas, the normal assumption is that the book view is static. The book view is it's not supra-local. The book view is something that all of us adhere to, though we may not know too much about it. And the field view is what people actually do. And these two are contrasted. But when I read this book by Professor Tuteja, I think that this distinction between book view and field view is perhaps a bit simplistic, because the book view is also the view of the Satyarth Prakash, which is actually the field view. That's what's happening. It's a communal view. It's not a communitarian view. And the book view, in fact, therefore, can be very partial, can be angular, and also, I think, projects a history or projects a view which is very partial and not a universal one at all, and unlike the way it is often presented to us. So the book view is not a universal thing that this is what people all believe in or should believe in. But the book view can also be a very partial view. And I think most book views are partial. And I think back on the classics as well. The classics are all very partial. Who's written them? For whom were they written? Against whom are they written? All these things come to mind. And therefore, the book view and the field view should not be seen in the simplistic terms, because the field view can also be the book view. And when I look at communitarian ideology, the multifacetedness of it, I think it's not really the book view over there. There's actually so many local cultures, local traditions, many, many books that come together to make the communitarian tradition. In that sense, it's richer. There are more books, there are more traditions, there are more practices that feature in communitarianism. Whereas in communalism, in fact, you could have a book, not all books, but a book, or maybe a book or two, but usually a book. And therefore, I think the book view, field view distinction that I was brought up on has somewhat moderated after reading this particular work by Professor Tuteja. The fact that communalism is so given to change It is not static, very, very labile, and it context-driven comes through in this work as well. And when I read this particular work, I think of some of the studies that I was sort of involved with. Let's say the study of Punjab militancy in recent years. And I find that the idea of communalism as propounded by Professor Tuteja is really quite apposite and works. For example, what is Sikh tradition? Once upon a time, let us take the popular view, Sikhism was supposed to be the sword arm of Hinduism. That same Sikh tradition was now recast as being the destroyer of the Hindu nation during the days of militancy. Likewise, we look at the Shivaji legend. At one time, he was supposed to be the protector of India against invaders. Then during the Samyukta Maharashtra Samiti period, it was used to, well, bring about Maharashtra and separate it from what later became Gujarat. And when the Shiv Sena came around, it was used as an anti-communist front. You know, Shivaji was also anti-communist. So communalism, I think, is not the same as communitarianism, as Professor Tuteja has shown us very explicitly, but it also tells us, when he discusses the rise of communalism in Punjab, how closely it is related to two features which I find very, very important from a sociological point of view, at least. One is the rise of organization, and the second is a uniform law. These two features are very important in my mind for understanding the rise of communalism in the way Professor Tuteja has described it. And he mentions it, of course. Professor Tuteja talks about the movement from a community, which is a complex relationship, to more a relationship which is more simplex in character, or multiplex to simplex. I think it does a good job in reminding us of that. In a pre-urban situation, you have what is called a generalized system of exchange. It's very generalized. So you have multiple relationships with a single person, perhaps. Whereas in the urban setup, the tendency is towards restricted exchange. But what is most important in all of this is that urbanization makes us look for simplicity and not for complexity, which is why you want to have a simplified understanding of Hinduism. You want to have a simplified language, which is what Mr. Dayanand, Swami Dayanand learned from Bengal. Instead of Sanskrit, turn to Hindi, because that is a language that people understand. What I found also interesting talking about Bengal is how much of Bengal has really influenced the rise of communalism in the Punjab. Professor Tuteja's book is littered with Banerjees and Chatterjees and Boses who have played an important role in the making of Punjab communalism. And also, yes, Rajput Rai, he started a newspaper called Bande Mataram. And the word Bande Mataram is very Bengali way of saying Bande Mataram. So I think Bengal and Punjab have a lot to do with each other. Finally, I'd like to say this, as Professor Tuteja has also said, and that is, it's so easy to misunderstand Lala Lajpat Rai, because he was really a communitarian who could easily be misinterpreted as a communal person. In fact, Motilal Nehru did it. Jawaharlal Nehru also cast aspersions on his secular credentials. Very often we are reminded of Bhagat Singh's poetry about a fallen hero, in which they say it is, well, about Lala Lajpat Rai. But the fact of the matter is that Lala Lajpat Rai was not only a supporter of Khilafat, he wrote in Urdu, and he wanted Hindu-Muslim unity, as all of us know. He also supported dining with Muslims, interdining with Muslims. And as has been said time and time again, he believed that those who wanted to put forward a Hindu nation were very, very misled people. In addition, he also said something which is very contemporary in terms of political theory. And I think Professor Tuteja mentioned, he did recall his indebtedness to Benedict Anderson. And like Jayaprakash Narayan, another work which has been published recently, Lala Lajpat Rai also brought to attention the fact that a nation state can have many religions. What is the problem? There is no reason at all why religion and nation state should go together. And he looked at European countries to make this point. You don't have to belong to one single nation, one single religion to belong to a nation. So the idea of one religion, one nation, one language, which many people think is what is the foundation of European nation state, is actually a textbook myth. It's never really existed. And Lala Lajpat Rai was absolutely on the button on that point, and he said this again and again in many of his writings. So in this and many other aspects, I found myself indebted to Professor Tuteja for bringing to light this work on Lala Lajpat Rai, and I'm so happy that he's written it, because more than anything else, he has corrected me, which is why I regret that he wrote so late. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. I now invite Professor Malhotra to address the viewers.
Thank you so much, Jyotika. And thank you, Prasoon, Varmaji, and Professor Tuteja for inviting me to, participate in this very distinguished panel. And it's to my delight that I am here today, to share some of my thoughts on this wonderful book that Professor Tuteja has written. Thank you, Jyotika and Sanmitra as well, for organizing this event. So I would like to begin by, congratulating Professor Tuteja on this, thoroughly researched big book on Hindu consciousness and nationalism in colonial Punjab. Writing a book like this, requires, I think, very, very painstaking research and very carefully balanced writing. And Professor Tuteja has managed that with praiseworthy panache. So, many congratulations to you. I think this book is especially appropriate now when the idea of Hindu consciousness has merged with that of the Hindu Rashtra. At such a moment, a book that makes nuanced arguments of multifarious ways in which Hinduness was thought about, where Hindus were perceived both as victims and as potent aggressors. And I think this is something that your book brings forth, tells you about the paths that were trodden, also not taken, and those that could have been potentially possible. And so this is really a welcome addition to the ongoing research on Punjab, which, as both Professor Habib and Professor Gupta before me have said, brought to us, the complexities of the situations as they developed in Punjab through the late 19th and early 20th century. In the book, Professor Tuteja makes a distinction between Hindu communitarian identity, as Professor Gupta just spoke about, and Hindu communal chauvinist one. The former specific approach of someone like Lala Lajpat Rai, and the latter espoused by Bhai Parmanand, Rai Bahadur, Narendranath, and so on, and which went on to develop the idea of Hindu Rashtra and Hindutva, the present moment, in a sense, that we are inhabiting. Professor Tuteja takes us through a gamut of developments that are very particular to Punjab. And I think that's the ambitious range of his work. This encompasses the restructuring of the Hindu middle class Punjabi life during the colonial period from the 1870s onwards. So we go through the establishment of the Arya Samaj in Punjab in 1877, the language controversy of Hindi Urdu, the cow protection movement, the particularly devious divisive designs of the Land Alienation Act of 1901 that divided the Punjabis into agriculturalists and non-agriculturalists, the 1905 Swadeshi movement, the 1907 agrarian disturbances, the establishment of the Hindu Sabha, Punjab Hindu Sabha, and through the 1920s into the Rowlatt Act, the Jallianwala Bagh massacre, And then the tensions of the 1920s, especially the Kohat riot that I think, changed the way Hindus thought very significantly. And then, of course, the coming of the Simon Commission and protests that accompanied it in Punjab. The period that the book surveys then is virtually, it coincides with the life of Lala Lajpat Rai, who was born in 1865 and died in 1928. And I think the book presents him as the prime example of Hindu communitarian identity, which the distinguished professors before me have spoken about. It is quite clear to me, as I read the book, that Professor Tuteja thought deeply on Lala's politics and perhaps even presented him as an exemplar of mature, even ethically sound politics vis-a-vis, Hindu organization. Thus, what he calls Hindu consciousness is presented through the prism of Lajpat Rai's politics and his intellectual and political growth. Tuteja ji strains to demonstrate Lajpat Rai embodying legitimate Hindu politics, the genuine concerns that arose out of the fear of Hindu minorities in Punjab in relation to a Muslim majority, the fear of numerical domination. I think that was a mindset at that point of time in relation, to the politics of, for example, separate electorates that you write so much on, and the working of diarchy in Punjab. Thus, Lala Lajpat Rai's simultaneous allegiance to the Congress and to the Hindu Mahasabha, his commitment to the Hindu cause and the nationalist one, his desire to strengthen the Hindus while advocating for Hindu-Muslim unity, and the need for these communities to work in unison in anti-colonial nationalist struggle are shown as reasonable politics. I think it is towards the end of your book, Professor Tuteja, sorry, beg your pardon, that somewhere I think there's a reflection, virtually on the last page in the last para of your book, where what you're telling us about the Hindu communitarian identity as it develops with Lala somewhere sort of creates a concern in you. And this is on the language question. I think the very question that attracted Lajpat Rai to begin with to the Arya Samaj, as he puts it in his Atmakatha, which of course was written in chaste Hindi and published in the Devanagari script. And I really want to emphasize that point, even though I think Kanhaiyalal Gauba in his autobiography speaks about the Lalas making the best speeches in Urdu, but Lajpat Rai strained to learn Hindi and Devanagari because he was so committed to the Arya Samaj and its politics. So this changing positionality of Lajpat Rai from his advocacy of Hindustani, which of course was meant to be used in Devanagari script by the Hindus and in the Nastaliq by the Muslims, so that division was to stay. And you ask, and he moved in 1926 in favor of Hindi. And Tuteja ji writes, and I'm going to quote him here, was it just an aberration in the political beliefs and working of Lajpat Rai, or a conscious attempt to assert Hindu majoritarianism in the shaping of the evolution of India identity? Was this a move away from his nationalist communitarian identity? You asked, Professor Tuteja. And I appreciate this pause that you make in your book, for I think the world today is mired in divisive nationalisms, and careful, empathetic thinking is essential, in a sense, to move forward. And I think that's what you do over here. Now, whether a person is a good Hindu or a bad Hindu, a communitarian Hindu or a communal Hindu, is increasingly becoming moot today, with aggressive, masculinist, and patriarchal assertions of that identity. But surely it depended on reflexive individuals like Lajpat Rai, who were willing to make that fine distinction, and I think willfully unwilling to ignite foot soldiers and mobs on democratic platforms and on demagogues' behests. That the after effects of the politics of Hindu minoritism and Hindu victimization incubated through colonial pedagogy, and I think that's a very, very significant point to make. It is colonial pedagogy that was fed to these men, and that created this knowing fear of victimization. And readily imbibed and I think disseminated by the Indian male middle class, has come home to roost. To say that is to actually state the obvious, because we are all living through that point. The larger point that I wish to make, and I beg your pardon over here, I think, somewhere there was, and maybe I'm speaking from hindsight, and of course I am, that there was a poverty of imagination of these male elites who far too readily refuse to imagine otherwise. For example, Rajput Rai found it very difficult to go along with Gandhi's premise of the need for Hindu generosity in order to build a tolerant, indeed tolerable nation, as Professor Tuteja shows us in his work. So the further few points that I want to make very humbly emanate from my own research. And so I'm not really someone who works on the Congress politics or the nationalist politics. So I will actually approach this work from a different archive, so to speak, from different sources, or from different viewpoints, perhaps even subaltern viewpoints, gendered and caste positionalities. And what does this world that was created by the likes of Rajput Rai and Bhai Parmanand and so on, what does this work look like? And I want to start with the question of language, because it is at this point that Professor Tuteja's carefully discussed analysis of Rajput Rai's politics somewhere ends in a small measure of despair. In this tussle between Urdu Hindi and Devanagari Nastaliq, where was the space for Punjabi language, I want to ask, which could have been written in multiple scripts, including Gurmukhi, but also in Devanagari and Nastaliq, as it still is. It's a question, for example, that Farina Mir has asked so eloquently in her work. A language spoken by all Punjabis in some dialect or the other did not appear on anyone's horizon as a possible uniting force, and was ceded to Sikhs as their language. And in fact, Sikh sacred literature is available in Sadhu Kadi, in Braj, in Persian, but not in Punjabi really. And thankfully, because of the Sikhs, the language has prospered, even if many Hindus have forsaken it. Mir has shown in her work how Punjabi Kisse remained popular through the colonial period in what she calls a Punjabi literary formation, circulating and giving joy to their myriad readers. Punjabi was relegated by educated Hindu Punjabis to the margins, as Prakash Tandon's autobiographical writings tell us in his memoirs, stigmatized by them as a language of low castes, of women, and therefore impure, and used in quarrels, but interestingly, also used intimately in moments of desire and love. As the Arya, Sabhaites, and Anjumans reorganized traditions for their acolytes, the tradition of saint veneration came under attack. This piety formed a culture of its own and shown in my earlier work as a domain of popular culture particularly pursued by women, against which men of all religious stripes and reformist inclinations declared an outright warfare as non-serious and not to be countered religiosity. I might add that Rajput Rai, himself an Agarwal Bania from Tudike Pind near Ludhiana, himself came from an ecumenical and eclectic background. His grandfather, he said, was a Jain, perhaps a Digambar Jain who used to wear a cloth on his nose. His father had, of course, Islamic, attracted to Islam. He taught Farsi, he knew Arabic, and he was an almost convert to Islam. I think the fact that his wife and children would have left him stopped him from converting to Islam. And this conversion was not because of jihad of any kind, but a genuine respect for a culture. His mother was a Sikh from a Keshdhari family, but followed Hindu rituals inside her marital home. But Lajpat Rai adopted the Arya identity and found it as the only relevant one. So these are choices that were made, in the late 19th century by these men. Lajpat Rai's participation in and collaboration with the efforts of Arya Samaj, Sanatanis, and Hindu Mahasabhaites, as Professor Tuteja shows, in promoting Shuddhi and Sangathan, even as far away as Mopla, Professor Tuteja, you tell us, in Malabar, and how that echoed all the way back in Punjab. Born out of the ideology of enhancing community numbers, the minority-majority prison that petrified the Hindu Punjabis, the politics of agglomeration that drove both the movements, purifying Muslims and Dalits into a strengthened Hindu fold, also incidentally belies the open caste system of the Arya Samajis. While Dayanand Saraswati did speak of caste by merit, he, on the one hand, retained the idea of caste as an essential organizing principle of society, which somehow, people are so taken in by his idea that, he speaks about caste by merit. Oh, so good. But caste is very much the organizing principle that you find in Satyarth Prakash. So societal hierarchy is retained one way or another. And on the other hand, if we read his Satyarth Prakash carefully, he often does, in fact, slip into speaking of caste by birth. And so a lot of people who, speak about Dayanand saying caste by merit actually do not read carefully his Satyarth Prakash. Nor does Saraswati at any time tell us how those who have suffered discrimination for centuries should find the ability, given the constraints of their circumstances, to acquire the fruits of education, the basis in his writing to recalibrate caste status. Thus, the bogey of open caste system can be put aside. Conversion was a contentious issue in Punjab always. The case of the 9th Sikh Guru, Tegh Bahadur, is a case in point, or as my recent work on the incorrigible and obstreperous Spiro, and I use these terms as compliments, shows. However, contention in Piro, and she does show conversion as a contentious issue, and perhaps also in the Guru's sacrifice, was offset by the idiom and the realm of bhakti, of devotion, that gave space to women and to the low castes. Shuddhi and Sangathan, on the other hand, far from ameliorating anyone's lot, were meant for the politics of elites, a highly performative, contentious, and vituperative politics meant to hurt and sow divisiveness in public life, in which it succeeded. The discussion that Professor Tuteja gives us on the conversion of Malkana Rajputs, for example, that the Arya Samaj was so invested in. I wish to point out that in this elitist masculinist politics, women and presumably Dalits were never envisaged as autonomous beings, unlike in Bhakti, with a will and subjectivity of their own. Rather, men were in charge of them, it seems, in perpetuity. The nationalist, communalist, communitarian imagination constituted men as citizens. As Lajpat Rai noted, speaking of Hindus, that in the time of fights and quarrels, and I'm quoting this from Professor Tuteja's book, Lajpat Rai's quote, that in times of fights and quarrels, their temples, their women, and their property is inviolable and unassailable. The resemblance to contemporary anti-conversion laws, where once again empowered men take control of their Dalits and their women, denying them not just autonomy, but full citizenship, needs reflection, I think, on our part. In a sense, we have had a long trajectory of reaching this present moment. Again, Professor Tuteja has shown, and I think it was earlier demonstrated to an extent, but in the work of Nethi Nair, that already from the 1920s onwards, some ideas of partitioning of Punjab began to be espoused by the Hindu elites. And I'd really like you, Professor Tuteja, to tell us a little bit more about this. Working on demographically designed spaces for community comfort, even when it was understood as destroying Indian unity. In this scenario, I'm tempted to ask, what did the idea of Punjab mean to its Hindus, and what does Punjabiyat signify to them then and today? So how should we look at Professor Tuteja's monumental effort at studying deeply our past that impinges so strongly onto our present? I think the book, impeccable in its research, nuanced in its argument, is a timely reminder of the contentions, erasures, missteps, good intentions, and uncertain results of our not so distant past. It is also a reminder that a genie that was released from the proverbial bottle of competitive performative politics may have remained relatively tame in the hands of those, like Rajputs, with an ability to rise above self-aggrandizing politics, but always had the potential to go out of hand, as seen in the 1920s, and then again in the 1940s, and then of course multiple times in post-colonial India. It also makes me reflect on Punjabi Hindus and their deep yet fragile attachment to Punjab. For Punjab in contemporary imaginary is seen increasingly as a land of the Sikhs, of Jat Sikhs, and perhaps of Dalit assertions. Importantly, I think. Perhaps today it seems that the vision for alternative politics, as for instance represented by Gandhi, or even seen in Punjab's women's popular cultural practices, was always precarious. For under the surface lurked a terrible reality of perceived victimhood that fed on fears and built imaginary monsters. That Rajput Rai swung between feeding these fears and ameliorating them speaks of a larger tragedy. I once again thank Professor Tuteja on his book, on helping us think through this enormously relevant past and its contemporaneous realities. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Professor Malhotra. I now request our final speaker, Dr. Pathak, to say a few words.
Yeah, am I audible?
Yes, sir, we can hear you.
Yeah, so thanks a lot to Mr. Verma for having invited me here. And of course, Primus has come out with a very good book on Punjab. And I really enjoyed reading the book. And regarding the book, first of all, what are the core takeaways from the book? That's the first point. So first of all, as Professor Tuteja himself said, he set upon the task of trying to explore the emergence of Hindu consciousness in Punjab since the 19th century. And he makes a very valid point that communities were very fuzzy, even till the late 19th century. In fact, maybe even after that. There has been work by Harjot Oberoi on the Sikhs, particularly, the construction of religious boundaries that makes the point very well. And of course, the fuzziness may not be just related to Punjab alone, because 19th century being the time when modernity came to India in various forms, also became the century in which things got organized and concretized. And that organization and concretization was set to influence any entity. So of course, 19th century is the century of isms, ISMS, and that concretization, and of course many of the colonial policies like the colonial census that enumerated people on grounds of religion. So all these were bound to create more structured religious communities. And of course, as Professor Tuteja has said, and Gyan Pandey had brought out about this colonial discourse on India, where India became the other of the West in the sense of religion being the moving force of Indian history. So those arguments have all been made. Now, the next thing that Professor Tuteja does is that this Hindu consciousness, and he's generally referring here to two aspects: Hindu consciousness vis-a-vis the other communities that were also organizing at the same time, particularly Muslims, at times Sikhs, and of course the interface of this emerging Hindu community or Hindu consciousness with nationalism, which was also emerging at the same time. So these are the core issues that he's referring to. And here, and this is also an argument that, the kernel of this argument I had read 20 years back in a very interesting paper that Professor Tuteja had written. And he had made this distinction between communitarian nationalism and communalism at that point of time. And this time, in this book, he goes into detail on nationalist communitarians and makes a distinction with the people he calls communalists. Now, nationalist communitarians, according to him, were people who believed there was no contradiction between serving the religious community that they belonged to and serving the nation. And this is also an argument that Gyan Pandey has made regarding, late 19th century up to the 1920s in his work, The Construction of Communalism in Colonial North India. So here, Professor Tuteja is, as he said, is breaking to an extent with a binary that was very fashionable up to the 1970s in India, maybe even up to the 80s. I think it was only the 1990s that the binary was challenged through some works. And the binary was the nationalist communalist binary, which basically argued that, the nationalists were secular and anti-imperialist, and the communalists were pro-imperialist or collaborators, and they had an internal other. For Muslim communalists, that was the Hindu. For Hindu communalists, those are the Muslims. So he breaks partially with the binary because he sees a gray area, which he himself said. And that gray area, basically the problem with the original binary of the 1970s, which was very fashionable at one point of time, was that it could not account for people like Lajpat Rai and Madan Mohan Malviya, and maybe a few others. If I take it forward, it would be perhaps Purushottam Das Tandon, or even later after independence, if I talk about, say, people like Sampurnanand, D.P. Mishra. So that binary did not fully, because the binary sees things in black and white, and these were instances of people whose politics has shades of gray. They are trying to be both Hindu and nationalist, and they are trying to do it consciously. So here he does, I must say, in fact, the strength of the book that I must say I saw was the way he has written about Lajpat Rai in detail. And I would want to commend him for that, because I haven't read in any book such a detailed narrative around the politics of Lajpat Rai. And why this is very important is also that, unfortunately, there have been historians in the past who have not given Lajpat Rai his due. Because I also did primary research on Lajpat Rai for my book, which I wrote for Primus, and there was a chapter on Lajpat Rai. And I realized in the course of the primary research that Lajpat Rai came across as a very sensible person. And repeatedly throughout his life, he made a very strong point that I am in the Hindu Mahasabha only on questions relating to Hindu community, and where there might be differences with any organization that claims to represent Muslims, like the Muslim League. And he would tell the Hindu Mahasabha in all his addresses that your work is limited to this. The question of the nation or the policy vis-a-vis the nation, the question of anti-colonialism, how the nation fares as such, is something that has to be left to the Congress. The Hindu Mahasabha cannot intrude on that. And that is a position that he takes all through his life. And unfortunately, Professor Tuteja also refers to a scholar in that. I also read Professor Aisha Jalal, and it's very unfortunate that there's a series of articles written by Lajpat Rai on the Hindu-Muslim problem around 1925, and there have been scholars who have misinterpreted and said that those articles show that he was committed to communalism or Hindu nationalism. The fact is that misquoting has gone on there, because Lajpat Rai said he said in frustration in that article that if we cannot reconcile Hindus and Muslims over the question of separate electorates, communal representation, and the kind of Muslim representation that is being demanded, then it is better to divide Punjab into Hindu majority and Muslim majority provinces. This has been quoted and taken as evidence that he was a communalist But the fact is that the very next line has not been quoted, which thankfully Professor Tuteja has italicized, and that is, let it be remembered that this is not a united India. This is a division of India between a Hindu India and a Muslim India. After that also, I find something very commendable about Lajpat Rai, that is, despite being in the Hindu Mahasabha on the Simon Commission, he took an openly antagonistic position to the Hindu Mahasabha, and also vis-a-vis Bhai Parmanand, which actually destroyed their relationship forever. And of course, soon after, Lala Lajpat Rai was martyred in that lathi charge. And in a public speech that the Tribune had reported, Lajpat Rai also said that there is no fixity in the demands of this section of the Hindu Mahasabha represented by Bhai Parmanand. And when there is no fixity in the demand, no reconciliation can happen. So I must commend Professor Tuteja on the way he has, in a way, explained to the readers what the politics of Lala Lajpat Rai was. Now, one more thing that I would like to say is the kind of, what are the conceptual differences that I may have with Professor Tuteja? And I think he already knows it because he's also gone through my work. The thing is, Professor Tuteja, I noticed that at some places he puts Hindu nationalism within quotes. In some other places, within Hindu nationalism is without quotes. In some places, he's using the word communalism, and in some other places, he's using the word Hindu chauvinism. So when he discusses the line that is represented by Bhai Parmanand in Punjab, which is very close to Savarkarite line, he, my only point is, let me put it this way. My understanding of the interface between communities and nationalism in India is somewhat different, which is also published. And according to me, nationalism in India was a contested space. The only thing that was being agreed upon by the people who saw themselves as Indian nationalists, or even see themselves now as Indian nationalists, was the geographical territory of the nation. But if that territory is fixed, what would nationalism imply? I will use that cliche that we often use, the idea of India. What would be the idea of India, or what would be the common sense that would inform being Indian? And here there was a contest all through. In that contest, there were some people like Jawaharlal Nehru, like Bhagat Singh, who would take very much a modernist and secular line. In fact, of course, Nehru's discovery of India is very much a civilizational text. But that apart, Nehru as prime minister, and I would say Bhagat Singh as a very well-known national freedom fighter, he took a line that was very consciously modernist and secular. Then there were people like Mahatma Gandhi, at one hand, who were more I would say, accommodative of the minority. And there were people like Lajpat Rai, who would say that, okay, India belongs to all, and all communities are valid, but there has to be a fair bargain between communities within the nation. So these people were people who saw the community as also the nation as legitimate. At the same time, there was also a third vision of nationalism in India, which saw the community as nation. And this vision, as Gyan Pandey beautifully brought out, what is communalism? Communalism is a category that was constructed sometimes in the 1920s, when secular nationalists felt that there is too much of Hindu-Muslim strife because of people who are trying to strengthen their communities also. And at that time, this category gets constructed, which says that those people who believe that, you can serve the community and be nationalist and think in communitarian terms, those people are communal. They are not nationalist. So, but in their own imagination, those people were nationalists. And in fact, I remember that 20 years back, I had asked this question to Professor Bipan Chandra, and I had asked him that if you say that nationalism in India had to be secular and anti-imperialist, how is it that there's a nation state called Pakistan next door, which is considered a nation state? So is it a nation state or a communal group? Because it was formed out of a process that was neither secular nor anti-imperialist. So I think this is one difference that Professor Tuteja already knows about. The other is that I also do not believe there has been a convention in historiography in India since independence to see the freedom struggle as nationalism or the national movement. The two are seen as synonyms. So to be a nationalist means you must have been a freedom fighter. Now, in this case, again, the freedom struggle was a method that was followed. Anti-colonialism was a method. Nationalism was an imagination that there is a nation, and also differences as to what constitutes the nation, how the nation, the national space has to be colored. So in this sense, in fact, Professor Tuteja rightly points out that Professor Panikkar, in one of his papers, said that the political aspect of nationalism, the freedom struggle came later. Before that came reform movements that sought to imagine or construct a nation within the social and cultural realm. So I would also say that people could be nationalists without being freedom fighters. It was always possible. And in this sense, I would say that my sole disagreement, of course, I'm not going into which is a better vision of nationalism or which is a worse vision of nationalism. That every citizen is free to kind of understand in their own ways. But certainly, I would see there have been practically two contesting visions of nationalism in India. There are three technically, as I said, but the secular vision and the composite culture vision often tend to come together because they believe that the nation should not have any internal sense of the other. And often the vision of community centric nationalism becomes an alternative vision. So what we are seeing in India today, for instance, is that the community centric vision, which was represented by say Bhai Parmanand or Savarkar, has become for the moment the hegemonic vision. In the times of Jawaharlal Nehru, it was basically the secular or slash composite culture vision that was hegemonic. So there's a cycle. It's a contest, and I think that it is very important as historians or researchers in history to first see the contest for what it is. So this is one thing that I would say, and uh, yeah. So roughly, one disagreement again with Professor Tuteja, and this also happened 20 years back when we talked. Professor Tuteja somehow believes that Swami Shraddhanand was not quote unquote a Hindu nationalist. But I feel that Swami Shraddhanand was also very much within the quote unquote Hindu nationalist stream. And Swami Shraddhanand's Shuddhi movement, that apart, one of the reasons he cites for his dislike for the Congress before, before joining it briefly during the non-cooperation movement, is that he says that the Congress exerts too much to get Muslims on board, just to make a show out of it. And in Inside Congress's work, he says that in the Lucknow session of the Congress, when he attended there, he says that all the Chandu Khanas of Lucknow were emptied so that a composite culture show could be created. So in that sense, I would say that Swami Shraddhanand's politics and the fact that he after when non-cooperation movement, he was part of the movement. He had also bared his chest before the police near Jama Masjid, but he also found a pamphlet written by Nizami, and he raised a stink about it and said that tomorrow the Maulanas will call the Hindu kafirs and they will not hesitate to kind of attack the Hindus. So I would say that he was very much in the same stream. Of course, within a single stream, there are always differences. Just like there are differences between Gandhi and Nehru and Patel. Similarly, there are also differences between Shraddhanand and Bhai Parmanand and some others. So that is another disagreement that I have with him. That apart, I must say that the expanse of the book. Okay, one more point, Professor Tuteja. That is when we talk about distinctive visions as compartments. Sometimes what happens, individuals follow trajectories, and here I would bring it to the notice of everyone that Bhai Parmanand, for instance, 1907, a pamphlet was recovered by the British police from where he was staying, Kensington Garden. And in that, he had written a scheme for the division of Punjab between a Hindu Punjab and a Muslim Punjab. So that was also something that is historically documented. But the same Bhai Parmanand, when the Roberts Satyagraha happens and non-cooperation starts, in fact, he comes out of the cellular jail in Andamans. He was sentenced to death in the Ghadar conspiracy, and C.F. Andrews was the one who actually managed to get his sentence commuted. 1921, he comes out. What does Bhai Parmanand do first? He gets impressed by Gandhi. And he gets impressed by Gandhi, plunges himself into the movement. How does he do it? When the Lahore National College was formed, Bhai Parmanand, taught as the history teacher there without taking a single paisa of remuneration. And if my memory serves me right, he was also Bhagat Singh's history teacher. Now, after this, what happens is that he suddenly, when 1923 onwards, in fact, just after Kohat riots, he suddenly takes another very, I would say, a very steep right turn. And then he starts saying that, the Muslims are like this, the Muslims can never live with the Hindus. He goes to the extent of saying that the only way for union in India is for Muslims to be entirely assimilated into Hinduism. So Bhai Parmanand also has his trajectories, but from 1922 or 23 onwards, he takes a very steep right turn. And I think these trajectories also have to be looked at in detail. Finally, I would say what impressed me most about the book was the expanse. Of course, as a panelist, going through it cover to cover was a very difficult task because it's really expansive. But I must say that when it comes to political Hinduism in Punjab, I think this is a volume that is very, very informative and detailed. And I would repeat again, in terms of anyone wanting to know more about Lala Lajpat Rai, I think this is the book that anyone must read. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, sir. Okay, we have time for a very brief interaction with the author, though we are running a little short on time. Professor Tuteja, we've actually had more of a comment than a question. So if I could read it out, I would be really grateful if you could just comment on it, give us your views. So the comment is, between the communitarian Hindu and the communal Hindu, there is a thin line. While there is a chance of sliding from the communitarian position to the communal one must look for the tipping point, which can go either way. For example, Sarat Chandra Chattopadhyay, a literator, was uneasy about Muslim politics, and his politics was certainly biased against Muslims. But towards the end of his life, he thought of the Bengali language as a bridge between communal differences. So he was moving towards communitarianism. So could you please share your views about this comment?
Yes, I just want to say about this point giving a very concrete example, and that is about Rajpat Rai. I will not talk about Sarat Chandra Bose because I have not read him, but I always see a possibility. If one is communal, there may be a possibility of his or her becoming as communitarian. But I would take the case of Rajpat Rai. If you see Rajpat Rai in 1920s or before 1920s, he is an outright communitarian where he believes that there was always a possibility of communitarian unity. And in Punjab, this communitarian unity was actually the more result of this shared tradition that was in existence earlier. Now, what happens that there were certain movements. For example, Lajpat Rai in 1924 onward, after Kohat riot, and the pamphlet and these long 14 essays which he wrote on Hindu-Muslim relations and responding to some of the issues raised by Gandhi, one could feel that there was some kind of his moving towards communalism. You know, what is here communalism? When you think other, I mean, when you create hatred against the other, indulge in violence against the other, or for me, consider community as a nation. Because I would answer here to another question that for me, Indian nationalism was inclusive nationalism. And therefore, if I have put the word Hindu nationalism within quote, I do not agree with it. And therefore, this is also a response to some extent to Vikas Pathak. But then I'm not going to take that. What I'm going to give an example to you about how Lajpat Rai moved from communitarian to communal. In 1926, he writes a letter against Parmanand. And he says, I detest Parmanand because Parmanand talks of a Hindu Rashtra. Now, his whole politics is about Hindu community. He sides with Madan Mohan Malviya, fights election against suffragist. But interesting thing is that in 1928, which Anshu also touched upon, that last paragraph of my book, that he supports the idea of Hindi language as one language. Why? Because this decision he took in a meeting which was held, Hindu Sammelan, called Hindu Sammelan, and that was headed by Parshottam Das Tandon. The main members were Parshottam Das Tandon, Malviya, and Rajput. Why he did it? He did it because this is the time in 1928 he wanted to give strength to the idea of Hindu majoritarianism. But for him, Hindu majoritarianism is a bargaining point vis-a-vis the Muslims in national politics. So his communalism, if you see it as something strengthening majoritarianism, yes, he appears as a communalist. On the other hand, if you see him that he fought against the idea of Hindu Rashtra, he comes out as a champion of inclusive nationalism. What I want to underline is that there is always a fear that a Hindu and any commentarian I will not call it weak movements, but under certain compulsions, there was always a possibility of moving towards communalism. And if you see in 1940s in Punjab, particularly when the partition took place, a number of people moved from commentarian to communal. So I agree with this point, but my point is that let us not fix anyone as commentarian or communal. We need to question it in a particular context. About Sarat Chandra, I'm sorry, I cannot comment because I have not read Sarat Chandra. Yes.
Thank you so much, sir. Unfortunately, we're running a little short on time, but I think we've been given a lot of food for thought by everyone, all the speakers here today. So I kindly request Mr. Prasoon Chatterjee now to wrap up this evening with the vote of thanks.
Thank you, Jyotika. From Primus Books, we would like to first thank our chief guest, Professor Irfan Habib, and our esteemed panelists, Professor Dipankar Gupta, Professor Anshu Malhotra, and Dr. Vikas Pathak for taking out time to be here with us and enriching our understanding of the intricate links of religion, community, and nation. I must thank our Managing Director of Primus and Ratnasagar Books, Mr. Sugat Jain, without whose support for the program, Primus would not have flourished into a hub of academic activity and publishing. It is a privilege for me to thank Mr. B.N. Verma, the head of Primus Books and the guiding light who has taken Primus Books to newer heights over the last decade. Finally, we are honored to be associated with the scholarship of Professor K.L. Tuteja and thank him for giving us the opportunity for publishing a wonderful book, which will, we hope, give rise to many significant research and discussions in the field in the future. And I thank you all who have attended the book discussion and the release for being here. It has been a really wonderful discussion and a lot of food for thought for us to think about and discuss and research on later. So thank you all, and let us close the wonderful session here. And thank you everyone for being here. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Yeah, there's a point that Mr. Verma wants to put.
Sir, you are on mute. Could you please unmute yourself?
Professor Gupta, I owe you an apology. I owe an apology to all the sociologists. This business of selectively addressing the historians was not the intention. It just so happened that we were rubbing shoulders, the place where I was working was rubbing shoulders with the Oxford University Press, who had virtually closed the gates for us at B School. We just couldn't go beyond publishing MSA Rao, Professor E. Ramaswamy, and the likes. They we could never go beyond them. And literally we had to sort of struggle to find a toehold in these schools. So my apologies if I didn't mention the name, but I did manage to publish a few good names, well-known names in JNU. And thank you very much.
I was just being facetious. Please don't take it seriously.
Sorry?
I was just being facetious. Please don't take it seriously.
No. I owe you an apology. And I also want to point out, to mention something which Prasoon has touched upon. The founding managing director had a totally different philosophy towards publishing. This is Dr. Dhanesh Jain, late Dr. Dhanesh Jain. He never believed in publishing for the sake of revenue, never. And he never stopped me from publishing any book. And I salute him and his son, who has donned the mantle of running this program, who has been so supportive that even during the pandemic, when all university and colleges, libraries were closed, we've been bringing out publishing books, bringing them out regularly. Throughout the year, we have been publishing. It's all thanks to the support of the present managing director. Thank you very much, Sugar. And thank you all. Many thanks.
Thank you all. Thank you all. Thank you very much, Anshu. Thank you, Dipankar. Thank you, sir. Irfan Saab, grateful to you for your comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Verma Saab.
Thank you, Professor Malhotra.
Thank you, Tuteja Saab. Many thanks. It was a pleasure working with you.
Thank you
And
very
Irfan
much.
Saab, with you particularly. The meticulousness with which you read your books is amazing. I mean,
Amazing.
2 years down the line, you keep sending me, okay, please, can you change this? Can you change that? It's a pleasure working with authors like you, really.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. Okay.